Okay, so today we are going to talk about when color finally came on the scene in films, and that was because of a company called Technicolor. So we're going to start by talking about a little color theory. Now, we have two different color theories, additive and subtractive. They're the opposite of each other, add, subtract, easy. Don't worry too much about remembering this color theory specifically, but there is a reason that I'm introducing it to you, and that is so you can understand the Technicolor process. So, if you know anything about digital screens and or printing, you might already be familiar with some of these or all of these theories. So in additive color theory, there are three primary colors: red, green, and blue. So it is different from the primary colors in art, which are red, yellow, and blue. This is RGB. So if you have ever looked at your digital screen at all or paid attention to that, you've seen these letters, RGB, because these are the colors that are used for digital screens. These colors can be used in any amount of proportions to make whatever color you want on the light spectrum. The way that you change the colors is by adding colors. And so all digital images, when you look at a computer screen, so like looking at me right now, everything you are looking at on this computer screen is made of red, green, and blue pixels. It's just there are different proportions of either red, green, or blue to make the different colors you're seeing. And as you layer in more colors in additive theory, it makes it lighter, which I know seems counterintuitive, but remember, this is for digital screens. It's not for painting. In paint, if you're, or art, if you add a bunch of colors, you're going to have a disgusting brown disaster. So the opposite, subtractive color theory, is the inverse. So that is cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, which means black. So that's CMYK. So again, if you've ever paid attention to your printer, you might notice that it prints in CMYK colors. Those are the different cartridges that you have to have in your printer to print color. So what are the secondary colors of CMYK? RGB, red, green, blue. What are the secondary colors of RGB? CMY, not K. So all printing, like print material, is done with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black dyes. So when you see a printed page, especially if it is color, it is done using different values of these colors to make up the colors that you're seeing. In subtractive theory, layering the colors actually makes it darker. So that's how you get that black. Well, there's a separate black ink, but I know that it sounds weird because in additive it makes it lighter and in subtractive it makes it darker. Don't worry about it too much. What I care about you remembering is RGB and CMYK, and that these are the opposites of each other. So why am I teaching you color theory? Like I said, RGB and CMYK, or additive and subtractive color theory, are the basics of Technicolor, which was the original film coloring process. And if you feel overwhelmed right now, just you wait, buddy, because Technicolor was an incredibly time-intensive and labor-intensive process, which is why even once color was more available to filmmakers, a lot of filmmakers still didn't use it. So Technicolor was the primary coloring process in the 30s and 40s. And basically what you did is you had this massive camera, like enormous. And this camera had a prism in it. And that prism would split the image that was coming through the lens into three separate strips. One was a red negative, one was a green negative, and one was a blue negative. So RGB. Then in the Technicolor process, those three strips were taken and they were dyed with their complementary colors. So they created a cyan positive, a magenta positive, and a yellow positive, or their negatives. I get so confused. Then they put all of these strips together to make the final color image. And something that was cool about Technicolor, we'll talk about that in a sec. So Technicolor images are really highly saturated. The colors are really intense in Technicolor movies. And so that's why Technicolor was saved a lot for films at the time, for like animated films, for big historical or biblical epics, and for musicals, because these were movies that relied really intensely on their use of color. And you could also adjust how much RG or B you had to kind of tint certain films or scenes. So that's why different movies have a different feel based on what percentage of color value they decided to put into the Technicolor strip, which is just so cool. So, as I said, color films did not become mainstream. You can see a Technicolor camera here on the right. These cameras were humongous. They were hot. They generated a lot of heat, and they were really expensive. The process that I just described was time consuming. It was hard to do. Conditions for Technicolor made it harder to film. So in addition to the camera generating a lot of heat, often Technicolor cameras required a lot of light. So they would have to have blazing lights on in this studio, which would make these studios incredibly hot. The studio, while they were shooting Wizard of Oz, would get up to 100 degrees. So this is why a lot of Technicolor was saved for these musicals, these big spectacles. So in addition to all of that, you had to have a consultant from Technicolor work with you in order to make a Technicolor film, which is another reason that Technicolor did not become the standard or the norm during this period of time. But those technical requirements also shaped how color films were made, because they had to, this was a big paradigm shift, just like with talkies. So this changed how films were made because of the technology. And so they had to take in different sound considerations, because the Technicolor camera was also, in addition to being bulky, hot, and expensive, really loud. So they had to make considerations for that changed how they made films. They had to make considerations for light. And so this is, again, we're seeing a big paradigm shift here. So this lady, Natalie Kalmus, is kind of the mother of Technicolor. So she co-founded the Technicolor Motion Picture Corporation with her then husband, Herbert T. Kalmus. And she became the executive head, or she was the executive head of the Technicolor art department from 1934 to 1949, which was Technicolor's height. So in that 15-year period, she consulted on every single film that was made with Technicolor. She had consultants under her, but so if you look on her IMDb page, it just says hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of movies. And she literally wrote the book on film color theory, but we will see that, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So you guys have a video here from Vox that is going to show you how Technicolor changed movies, and it's going to explain the Technicolor process with a visual, so hopefully it'll make more sense when you see it there. So go ahead and pause me and go watch this video from Vox. It is on Canvas. How Technicolor changed movies. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that video. I think it's so neat. So we're going to look at a couple of films that were shot in Technicolor but use their color very differently. The first is going to be Wizard of Oz. This was not the first color film. Color films have existed since the teens, but this film used Technicolor in new and interesting ways and really kind of popularized it. So just like The Jazz Singer was not the first talking film, and Birth of a Nation was not necessarily the first feature film, they were the first that spread it across Hollywood. So Wizard of Oz, because it used Technicolor in this interesting way, kind of set a new standard for Technicolor films in Hollywood, and it focused on sort of the fantasy elements. So you're going to watch some clips from Wizard of Oz. You're also going to watch some clips from Gone with the Wind. This was a film that actually came out the same year. 1939 was a pretty big year for Hollywood. And this is a historical epic. So it's going to show the costumes off differently. It's not fantasy. It's set in reality. It's set in the Civil War in America. So I want you guys to really pay attention to how these films use Technicolor and how it's different, the same, etc. And I want you guys to talk about that after you watch your clips. Enjoy!